Alright, y'all. So picking up where I left off in my last video, where I detailed how so-called blacks started to lose their rulership and also their place in Europe in general, due to a lot of the wars and conflicts that were being caused mainly by the Protestant Reformation. And so now we're going to continue with that topic by looking at a very pivotal time period in European history and even arguably world history. And the event that happened during this time period was known as the French Revolution. France had a history of dealing with a monarchy that was known as an absolutist monarchy that dated back to King Louis XIV, who I already mentioned in my last video was a so-called black man, but I'll talk about him in another series on the various dynasties of France. But anyway, since Louis XIV, the French citizens had to deal with an absolute monarchy, which basically just meant that a king had the ultimate authority over the areas that they ruled over without having to answer to any sort of government or the citizens. And so they had to deal had to deal with things like heavy taxes. The citizens had to deal with heavy taxes that were placed on them so that kings like Louis XIV could have very expensive vanity projects made in their honor, like the Palace of Versailles that he made and had completed in 1715. And then his successor, Louis XV, who again was also a so-called black man. I believe he was described as being swarthy in his formative years, but anyway, Louis XV also mercilessly taxed the citizens of France in order to fund his oftentimes unsuccessful military campaigns. So the French citizens had gone through a lot within this short time period of about a little bit over 100 years before it all came to a head when Louis XVI came into power and became the last straw for the French citizens and their tolerance for absolutist monarchs. Due to a lot of King Louis XVI's mishandling of the general French populace, like the peasants and the lower classes, and his once again merciless taxation of the regular French citizens, but not the aristocratic caste of France, as well as the exuberant amount of spending on things like France's involvement in helping out Great Britain during the American Revolution, along with a bevy of other things, made the French citizens grow tired of Louis XVI and the monarchy of France in general, which led to the French Revolution starting around 1789. Louis XVI was famously killed by way of the guillotine in 1793, and this signified the citizens of France deposing and taking down their own king from power. And this was almost unprecedented in the history of Europe. A king being deposed by his own citizens was unheard of, and this ushered in a new era of government within the country of France, where France would now become known as the Republic, and they would go by the name of the Republic of France, which was again something that was unprecedented in Europe up until this point. And besides the citizens growing tired of the kings due to their mishandling of power, a lot of these scientific revolutions that had been going on during the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries lessened the belief in a concept that was known as the quote-unquote divine right of rulership, which basically dictated that the kings who ruled in Europe were ruling under the auspice of God himself. So because of this, they had the right to rule. But since these scientific revolutions had lessened people's beliefs in God, they no longer believed in this sentiment of monarchs being anointed by God to rule over them. So a lot of different countries from around the world started to take inspiration from what was going on in France during this time period. And a lot of them started to question the need for a monarch ruling over them. And this led to France, as well as other countries, adopting the political system that we know of today as democracy, where they believe that all men should have the right to vote for the people in parliament or government, as well as even being able to elect kings in certain areas of the world. A lot of European countries were slowly becoming more democratic. Countries like Spain, which adopted a limited democratic government in 1810, and then even Portugal, who also adopted a limited democratic government in 1820, and the countries that weren't becoming outright democracies and still allowed kings to rule over them and their lands implemented something that is known as a constitutional monarchy, which is basically just when a monarch shares power with a constitutionally organized government. But in a lot of cases, like today in Great Britain, for instance, the monarchs really didn't have that much power at all, and most of the power was divested over to the members of parliament. So essentially, these monarchs didn't have much of any power to do anything at all. And so European countries that adopted this form of government were first England, as I mentioned in my last video. England, while under the rulership of King William III and Queen Mary II, two so-called black people, by the way, but they were some of the first to have constitutional monarchy implemented during their rulership by way of the Bill of Rights being introduced, which greatly lessened their power from predecessors of theirs. And this carried over into the next regime, which was ruled over by the Hanoverians and kings like King George the First, the Second, and the Third, and then even into other countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. They also adopted constitutional monarchies, which again greatly lessened the power of their monarchs. So all this was going on, and like I stated, it was lessening the power of the monarchs, who were largely so-called black still during this time period. And the person who was at the center of this time period is one of the more well-known and renowned figures in history, who changed a lot of the dynamics of government in Europe and even around the world with the civil law code that he introduced to France in 1804. This figure that I'm referencing is known to history as Napoleon Bonaparte. And so now, before I go further, I just want to take a second to pause real quick and look at Napoleon Bonaparte and some of the rulers that reigned during his time period, while blacks were starting to lose their rulership. Again, a lot of the monarchs of Europe during this time period were still so-called black, but by now the Caucasian had made up more of the population in Europe, and a lot of the original black population in a lot of these countries have been casted out from their homelands. But that will be something that I will show more later on. But yes, the Caucasian had started to become more dominant in Europe during this time period, which led to more racial admixture even amongst the elite in Europe, which is why a lot of monarchs started to look more mixed race. I think I mentioned in my last video series that the Hanoverians and guys like King George and even his queen, Queen Charlotte, who was a known mulatto, were mixed race so-called blacks. This was going on a lot during this time period, and we'll see it with a lot of the figures I'm about to show in a minute here. But the main person I want to go over is Napoleon, and what I'm about to say may sound controversial, but I mean, it is what it is. It's the truth. Napoleon Bonaparte was indeed a mixed race so-called black man who had black lineage going all the way back to one of his ancestors, who was the first of his familiar line to migrate to the famous land that Napoleon was known to have come from, which was the island of Corsica in France, near the area in Corsica known as Ajaccio. And a lot of Napoleon's family members and descendants were documented having complexions that were extremely dark due to, again, them being heavily mixed race, but having a lot of the features of their ancestors being bred out due to all the admixture that underwent over the years. But let me go about proving this by first looking at the aforementioned ancestor of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was known as Francisco Bonaparte, and see why I stated that he was a so-called black man. So this book I'm citing from is going to give us an idea of what Francisco Bonaparte looked like, who once again was a direct male ancestor of Napoleon, who emigrated to Corsica in 1529 and or a little bit over 200 years before Napoleon was born. So let's read what this has to say about Francisco Bonaparte's appearance. So let's read this. So Francisco, who is styled by official documents the Moor of Sarzana, or Francisco Bonaparte, called the Moor either on account of his unusually swarthy complexion or because he had served under Ludovico the Moor, who was also a so-called black man as well, Ludovico the Moor. But we see here that Francisco Bonaparte was indeed called the Moor, and that term Moor, as I've already referenced before in some of my other previous series, that term Moor, when it was applied to somebody, was meant to indicate that they were so-called black. That term Moor was a synonym for a black person during this time period, round about the 16th to 17th century. And this is evidenced by, for number one, William Shakespeare and his use of the word Moor to describe so-called black characters in his plays like Aaron the Moor or even Othello the Moor. The reason why he used that term to specifically describe so-called blacks in his plays was because this was indeed a term that was used to describe black people, particularly ones who had very, very dark skin. And it was like being somebody being called the Moor was like the equivalent of us calling somebody today who was who was a so-called black man or black woman, quote unquote, dark skin. You know how when you have people say someone is dark skin or light skin or brown skin, that was basically what calling somebody a Moor was like. It was like calling somebody a dark skinned black person today. So yes, that term Moor was indeed a term that meant a black person. But yet another example of this can be gleaned from the other person that is mentioned in this excerpt, who I already mentioned was a so-called black man in Ludovico the Moor. Now, when you look up descriptions of Ludovico the Moor, it will straight up tell you that he was called the Moor because of how dark or even black his skin color was. And yet another example comes from the Italian nobleman who was a son of one of the Medicis, who were also so-called black, by the way, but I'll get more into them later on when I talk about the noble families of Italy. But Alessandro de' Medici was also called the Moor, and even conventional scholarship will tell you that he was a so-called black man, even though they'll lie and state that he was a result of a relationship that ensued between an African slave and a member of the Medici family named Lorenzo, Duke of Umbrino, if I'm not mistaken. But this theory has already been found to be a lie. And an author from that time period named Jean Nestor stated that the rumor of him being the son of an African slave was a false rumor that was spread by some of his enemies, and his mother is already on record as being an Italian peasant woman. So he was not in fact the result of an African slave mixing with a so-called Caucasian Italian man, which wouldn't be the case anyway, because like I already stated, the Medicis were so-called black people. But again, I'll get more into that when I talk about them. But just getting back to the point, so yeah, this nickname that was given to Francisco Bonaparte was more than likely bestowed on him, because like Ludovico or even Alessandro de' Medici, who were also bestowed with that nickname of quote unquote Il Moro, he too was a so-called black man. So now that we've established that Napoleon did in fact have so-called black lineage in his family, let's go about seeing how Napoleon was described. Because like I stated earlier, he was a very mixed race man that didn't necessarily have the facial features of someone that we would classify today as quote unquote black. He had a long nose and a straight kind of lanky hair that was coarse, but it wasn't quote unquote woolly or quote unquote nappy. But he did have the skin complexion of somebody who will be classified today as quote unquote black, which evidences lineage going back at one point in time to a black ancestor who we have already identified as Francisco Bonaparte. So let's see a couple of descriptions of Napoleon real quick to see what I'm talking about. Book I'm going to read from was written by someone who actually knew Napoleon and had a very close friendship with him. So a description of Napoleon doesn't get more accurate than this one right here. So let's read what he has to say about Napoleon's appearance. So when at Brienne, Bonaparte was remarkable for the dark color of his complexion, which subsequently the climate of France changed. Yeah, in my opinion, they just threw this part in the in the parentheses in there as a lie to try and show, or to try and throw off what this person said about Napoleon's skin color being dark, because even Benjamin Franklin referred to the people of France as a general population being a people of swarthy complexion. So the climate of France couldn't have changed his complexion that much, if any at all, since pretty much everybody in France had a quote-unquote swarthy complexion at that time. But I'll talk more about that later on in the next video. But anyway, we can see here that one of Napoleon's closest friends stated that he had a dark color to his skin, i.e. he was a dark-skinned man. So he had to have been a man of color if he was described as being a man of dark skin or dark complexion, like this contemporary source claims him to have been. But let's see what another contemporary source has to say about the appearance of Napoleon. So now let's read this description of Napoleon from another eyewitness account. It's somebody who was unnamed and was, just as it says right here, an Englishman in Paris, but nevertheless, this person most likely saw Napoleon in person, and either way would have known what he looked like. So let's read what this has to say regarding Napoleon's appearance. So an Englishman in Paris describes Napoleon at a review on August 3rd, 1802. Bonaparte, he says, wore a plain green coat with a narrow white cloth edging at the seams and a cocked hat without any lace. His hair is very black and is cropped very close to his head and neck so that his ears are all bare. It falls down over his brow. His complexion is swarthy, his face long, a fine nose, his eyes are very dark, and his eyebrows fall or are drawn down much over his eyes. So we see here that another what sounds like eyewitness account of Napoleon's appearance states that he was a man with a dark skin color, because that is what that term swarthy means. I've already gone over numerous times what this term swarthy means on this channel, but let's just for the sake of a reminder, actually see what it means once again. And we're going to pull the definition of swarthy from a couple dictionary sources that were actually made around this time period, not modern day dictionary definitions that may give us a different meaning for what this term swarthy meant. So let's just take a look at some of those to get an idea of what Napoleon being called quote unquote swarthy could have looked like. So this is a dictionary that was written by a man by the name of Samuel Johnson in and around 1768, which, if I'm not mistaken, was a year before Napoleon was even born. So it was in and around the same time of when that quote that described him as swarthy was given. So language most likely hadn't changed that much by then. But let's read what this definition of swarthy states about what this or about what that kind of complexion entails. So it says right here, a dark complexion. Okay, so that's right in line with the first quote I cited from, where Napoleon's close friend or close confidant gave of him when he stated that Napoleon was remarkable for his dark color. So let's keep reading. So it also says black. So I've told you guys before that the term swarthy before anything else in its oldest form originally meant black. So when someone was referred to as swarthy during the medieval time period or the Middle Ages, that was them basically being called black in reference to their skin color. And that same sentiment is still held in this definition of the term swarthy. But looking at the next word, the term dusky comes up. And I believe that this dictionary defines dusky to mean tending to darkness and also tending to blackness. So again, the term swarthy is associated with being called so-called black. And then the last word it gives is tawny, which this dictionary definition defines as yellow. But tawny was actually a color that was inclined more to a brownish yellow color or like a orange brownish color. But either way, the word tawny was associated with the word brown. When you look up the etymology for tawny, it means brown with a yellowish or orange undertone, and also dark brown as well. And then I believe, just going back to Benjamin Franklin's quote real quick here, he stated that all Africa was black or tawny, which confirms that tawny did indeed mean someone who was brown, but also that he was basically saying that the Africans at the time had complexions that as a whole inclined to swarthy, since we know that the term swarthy means both of those terms, right? It means both dusky and tawny. Or excuse me, black and tawny. And even the Noah Webster Dictionary defines the term swarthy pretty much the same as the Samuel Johnson one did, but then it gives the example of Africans being swarthy, and we know that Africans typically range from being somewhat of a brown color to black as well. So yes, this term swarthy was a word that typically described a person of color or a so-called black person. So according to the two sources that we just read from, Napoleon was a man of color, and from the ancestor of his that I showed, who was literally nicknamed the Moor due to his own swarthy complexion, we can easily see that Napoleon had black lineage and that he also had the skin complexion of a so-called black man. But like I stated earlier, Napoleon was of a more quote-unquote mixed race looking appearance due to him being born in and around a time period where the Caucasian was more prevalent in Europe, and so unerringly, admixture is going to take place. But one of the ways we can tell that Napoleon was mixed race is by looking at descriptions that describe his facial features in depth, even more than the ones that I pulled from so far, which just focus mainly on his complexion. And there is also a portrait of Napoleon that exists, which fully encompasses Napoleon's appearance as well, and what I've stated him to have been, which is a mixed race, so-called black man. And this is a theme that we're going to see remain consistent when I show some of the other royalty figures that existed alongside Napoleon. But I'll speak more about that when we get to that section of this video. But for now, let's just look at some of these other descriptions of Napoleon real quick. Alright, so let's read this little Wikipedia excerpt to see some descriptions of Napoleon Bonaparte by multiple different contemporaries of his that, of course, saw him and lived during his time as Emperor of France and before, or before he was Emperor of France. And once again, pay attention to some of these descriptions because, again, a lot of them hint at what I've been stating while I've been talking about Napoleon, which was that he was indeed a very mixed race, so-called black man. But let's read some of these descriptions here, starting with this first one that was given by this English painter, Joseph Farrington, who this states right here, met Napoleon in 1802. So again, all of these are people who actually saw Napoleon in person. But let's read what he said. Let's read what he said here about Napoleon's appearance. So Samuel Rogers stood a little way from me and seemed to be disappointed in the look of Napoleon's countenance and said it was that of a little Italian. Farrington said Napoleon's eyes were lighter and more of a gray than I should have expected from his complexion. And stop right there. So what this person means when he says that Napoleon's eyes seemed lighter than what should have been expected from his complexion, was that he was basically trying to get at is that Napoleon's eye color didn't match up from what one would typically see someone with that eye color skin complexion having. So, because generally speaking, the eye color gray is seen amongst people of so-called Caucasian descent, i.e. someone with a lighter skin tone or a lighter skin color. And from the descriptions that I've read thus far, Napoleon was very dark-skinned, so him having such a dark complexion with the eye color that he had was not something that was usual to see, especially from someone who supposedly was fully Caucasian, which is what we're to believe about Napoleon, right? But this person is giving us some insight into, again, Napoleon's more mixed race appearance. But let's read further. Let's read further on and see how else Napoleon was described. So let's look at Johann Ludwig Witzenberger's description of Napoleon. And this man was someone who accompanied Napoleon during some of his campaigns in 1797 and 1798. So again, another eyewitness account of what Napoleon looked like is who is speaking here. But let's read what he has to say. So Bonaparte was rather slight and emaciated looking. His face too was very thin, with a dark complexion. His black unpowdered hair hung down evenly over his shoulders. Okay, so again, another contemporary eyewitness account source stated that Napoleon was a man of dark complexion, so it should go without saying that Napoleon had to have been a man of color. So now let's scroll down here and look at yet another description, this time coming from a Russian poet during the Napoleonic Wars, named Denis Dedov, if I'm not mistaken. So let's see his description of Napoleon. So his face was slightly swarthy with regular features. So we see again, Napoleon was described as being swarthy. And then it goes on to say his nose was not very large, but straight with a slight noticeable bend. The hair on his head was dark reddish blonde. His eyebrows and eyelashes were much darker than the color of his hair, and his blue eyes set off the almost black lashes, his blue eyes set off the almost black lashes gave him a most pleasing expression. So there are a couple of things here to look at. I already pointed out one of them, which was that he was described as being swarthy, once again by another contemporary source, but he was also described by this particular person as having a straight nose and dark reddish blonde hair. And a lot of sources are weird about Napoleon's hair. Some say that he had black hair, some say that he had brown or various shades of brown hair, and this guy right here is saying that he had dark reddish blonde hair, which is kind of like a brownish color. But either way, we can see in this description how Napoleon had features that, as I already stated, implied that he was very mixed race. The straight nose, the kind of brownish, dark reddish hair, and also the blue eyes, which is another thing sources tend to conflate on. Some say blue and some say gray, and so so he most likely had a mixture of the two. He most likely had a mixture of either blue or grayish blue eyes. But just like from the quote I read earlier, when I quoted Joseph Farrington, he stated that he thought his gray eyes were out of place from his complexion because he was so dark-skinned, and that eye color normally was seen amongst people who had a lighter skin tone. So again, he had features that implied a very mixed race background, but his lineage goes back to a so-called black man, which is why he had such a dark skin complexion. But let's read one last source that tells us of Napoleon's dark skin color real quick. So this is a book that was written by a man from Britain after the events that occurred during Napoleon's life. So he was not a contemporary or eyewitness account like the other sources that I read from. But what this author will provide us is an understanding of the dark complexion that Napoleon was known to have had when he was alive and even after he was gone, and just how dark in complexion he was. So this was a British satire that was written about Napoleon in mockery of him, since he was rivals with Britain, who were responsible for his most momentous defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. So some of the things in this book may be a little bit biased against Napoleon, but this description I'm about to read from is very consistent with the descriptions that we've already seen all throughout this segment of the video. So it is not an exaggeration, or it's not that much of an exaggeration. So now let's read what this has to say. So the said Napoleon Bonaparte, alias Jaffa Bonaparte, alias Opium Bonaparte, alias Whitworth Bonaparte, alias Acre Bonaparte, is a Corsican by birth, about 5 feet 4 inches in height, of a swarthy black complexion. Okay, so again, Napoleon is referred to as having a swarthy complexion, but this author takes it a bit further and states that Napoleon also had a black complexion as well, which is basically like saying swarthy, since, as we've already gone over, the term swarthy quite literally means so-called black. So again, Napoleon had the complexion of a so-called black person because his ancestry was at the very least part so-called black, mainly on his father's side, since the aforementioned ancestor of his that I talked about earlier, Francisco Bonaparte, the Moor, or so-called black man of Sarzana, was his direct male ancestor. So yes, Napoleon did have black ancestry, even if a lot of his features were not characteristically quote-unquote negroid. But there is one final thing that I want to show on Napoleon, and it's an actual portrait of him that was made, which shows him with this quote-unquote swarthy black complexion that he was described having here in this book. And this portrait was made during his lifetime, I believe around the year 1807, while he was still the emperor of France. So let's take a look at this portrait real quick. So this is the portrait right here of Napoleon Bonaparte that shows him with literal black or swarthy skin. Based off of the descriptions that we read of Napoleon so far, this most likely is an accurate portrayal of what his skin color looked like and of what he looked like in general. If you look closely, you can see the long nose that he was often described having, and then also the dark hair that is cropped close to the head and neck that the second account I cited from stated he had. And I know it may be very hard for you guys to see from your vantage point, but it does depict him with the gray eye color that he was described having as well. So this is definitely an accurate depiction of Napoleon Bonaparte. And like I stated before, even though he had the skin complexion of a so-called black man, due to his lineage at least paternally being black, his facial features and other features were not like what we would conventionally consider to be quote unquote black or negroid looking features, which would imply that he was indeed mixed race. And what's funny about this portrait is when you look at the description, it'll say that this portrait was made by an unknown artist. And this is something that they do oftentimes with the real portrayal of historical figures in history that they will never tell the truth about in regard to their lineage. They'll take, again, the real portrait of a major historical figure like Napoleon Bonaparte and say that the artist who made it was unknown, but then they'll take a fake portrait like this one right here and give the name of the artist so that the painting will have more credibility in the minds of the people. This portrait was allegedly painted by Louis Philibert Deboucourt, and coincidentally enough, this portrait was allegedly painted the same exact year the first one that I showed was painted, and we can see that it's virtually the same, minus of course the complexion and a few minor other details. But for the most part, Napoleon is standing in the exact same pose in this portrait right here. His arms are folded in both of the portraits. He has the same hat, the same jacket, same sword on the side of his hip. So these are pretty much the same portraits, but which one is the real one? Well, we should know by now, based off of the descriptions that we just read of Napoleon, as well as the ancestor of his that we should know was a so-called black man, based off of him being called the Moor. The first one that I showed has to be the more accurate portrayal, right? So this portrait definitely shows how Napoleon would have looked like while he was alive. What's interesting though is that Napoleon wasn't the only one in his family that was described having this dark or swarthy complexion, which should be obvious since if his family also came from the same lineage as him or the same patrilineage as him, they also should have had the same or similar physical characteristics as Napoleon. So let's take a look at some of his relatives and see how they were described. So this is a description of a nephew of Napoleon's by way of Napoleon's younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte. So Napoleon's brother, coming from, of course, the same father, who I have already identified is where the main portion of his black lineage came from. That would mean that he had to have looked similar to Napoleon and how he was described, right? He had to have had the same dark complexion, but quote-unquote mixed race features as his brother. So let's see if that complexion was seen in his son. So the eldest son, Charles, now Prince of Canino, married Lettia, the eldest daughter of the uncle Joseph, and at present is in the 47th year of his age. He has distinguished himself by researchers in natural history, and in particular by an extended edition of Wilson's American Ornithology. The appropriate section of the British Association is pretty regularly honored with the presence of a little middle-aged, dark-complexioned gentleman, the very image of the great emperor, talking about Napoleon. So here we see that Charles Lucien, again, a relative of Napoleon's, had the same dark complexion that he did, and this excerpt even states that he looked just like Napoleon because of his dark complexion, which we should know by now Napoleon definitely had. So the black lineage of the Bonaparte family was still seen through the generation after him, which is something that would continue with another nephew of Napoleon's who became the Emperor of France shortly after Napoleon and was also the first president of France as well. So let's see how he was described. So this excerpt that I'm going to read from is actually going to give us an idea of what a couple of the Bonaparte family members looked like. The first one being, who I already mentioned, was Napoleon's other nephew, who is known to history as Charles Louis Bonaparte, or simply as Napoleon III, and also Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. So now let's read their descriptions and see if they line up with how Napoleon was described. So let's first start out by reading about Joseph Bonaparte. So it is said that Joseph Bonaparte, although a few inches taller than Napoleon, looked more like him than any of his brothers. So let's see why this was. So his manners were full of ease, elegance, and grace. He was very pleasant and quite disposed to free conversation, about 5 feet 9 or 10 inches high, heavy set, dark complexion, black eyes and hair heavy brows, a large round head, square high forehead. Okay, so yet again, another family member that is described with the same dark skin color that Napoleon was described having, and it is said in this excerpt that Joseph Bonaparte looked more like Napoleon than any of his brothers because of his dark complexion. So now let's read the description of Charles Louis Bonaparte, whose skin complexion was compared to another major figure in France, who was the son of a close confidant of the Bonaparte family and of Napoleon himself. But we'll see who that was in a minute. But let's just read Charles Louis's description real quick. So Charles Louis, his son-in-law, was rather taller, but not so thick, black hair and eyes, dark complexion. So again, another Bonaparte family member, who was described with a dark complexion, which we should know by now, what that exactly looked like from the portrait that I showed of Napoleon, who was described as having a dark complexion as well. So Charles Louis had to have had a similar complexion to that, but probably not as dark. But let's pay attention to this next sentence, because the person who Charles Louis was compared to in this excerpt is going to shed some light on a sentiment that I've been talking about all throughout this video, which is that for number one, Napoleon and the Bonaparte family were mixed race people with black lineage, going all the way back to Francisco the Moor of Sarzana, and then also that a lot of the royal families during this time period were also mixed race, so-called blacks, having lineages going back to so-called blacks that ruled Europe, and a lot of their descendants today even have that same lineage, but they don't look like their ancestors, a lot of their so-called black ancestors, because of the admixture that has taken place over the course of time. But let's read this before we get into that. So Akil Murat, strongly resembled Charles, about the same size and complexion. So this states that Charles Louis resembled this man named Akil Murat, and Akil Murat was the son of a major figure in the Napoleonic narrative who was called Joachim Murat. Joachim Murat was one of Napoleon's greatest marshals and cavalry leaders, and he helped Napoleon win some of his most famous and memorable battles, like the Battle of Austerlitz. And he was also an admired soldier and close confidant of Napoleon's, that Napoleon bestowed on him. So much so that Napoleon bestowed on him prestigious titles, like the Grand Duke of Berg and Cleves, the governor of Paris, and he rewarded him with the right to the King of Naples, or the title of the King of Naples. And he also allowed Joachim to marry one of his sisters, Caroline Bonaparte. Which is where you get the union between the two houses of Bonaparte and Murat, which still persists to this day. And we'll take a look at some of their descendants in a little bit, because they prove an essential part in proving one of my main sentiments in this video that I mentioned. But Joachim Murat was an essential figure in Napoleon's history, and what's interesting about him is that during his lifetime, he was described as someone who was obviously a so-called black man with black lineage, which was evident by a lot of his physical characteristics. And like I already stated, he was the father of the same man who was being compared to Charles Louis Bonaparte in this passage that I'm reading out of, in regards to his complexion and how dark it was. And what's significant about this is that it proves that the Bonaparte family, just like Joachim and the Murat family, were indeed of mixed race origin, because Joachim himself was mixed race, and he was of mixed race origin. And this is according to a myriad of different first-hand account sources who saw Joachim in person and stated that he was obviously Negroid looking in appearance. So let's read a few descriptions of Joachim Murat. So let's take a look at this description of Joachim Murat that was given by a famous French writer at the time named Laura, Duchess de Abrantes, who knew Joachim Murat personally and gave a very interesting description of what he looked like. So let's read how she described Joachim Murat. So there was a great deal of the Negro in his face. His nose, it is true, was not flat, but his lips were thick. This nose, although straight, lacked distinction, thus giving him, in keeping with the rest of his features, at least the appearance of a half-breed. And the person who wrote this, who wrote about this quote was J.A. Rogers, I believe, and he pulled this quote from a book that was actually written by the president of the French, who acted as the president before Charles Louis, and the book was titled, I believe, The History of the French Revolution, Volume 3. But anyway, we can see here from this quote that the Duchess de Abrantes, who again knew Joachim Murat, describes him as being very Negroid in appearance, and his descriptions, one more of which we'll look at in a minute here, but his descriptions actually sound a lot like another mixed race so-called black general in Napoleon's army named Thomas Alexandre Dumas, who was also described as a man with quote-unquote thick lips and curly hair, and he was undoubtedly known to be a black man with mixed race lineage. So it's a wonder why Joachim Murat has never been designated as such in the mainstream. You know, it makes you think, or at least it makes me think, who else could have been so-called black? The conventional history doesn't tell the masses was indeed a black person, besides, you know, the hundreds of figures that I've already gone over on this channel. But anyway, yes, Joachim Murat was a mixed race black man whose son Akil Murat was described as resembling Charles Louis and even having the same exact dark complexion as him. So if Akil Murat's father was of mixed race origin, and if he resembled Emperor Charles Louis in his complexion, then what should that tell you about Charles Louis's ancestry? Akil Murat was also the product of Joachim and Caroline Bonaparte, who I already mentioned was given to Joachim by Napoleon to be his wife, and we've already seen how Napoleon and some of his brothers were described. So it should be fair to assume that she must have had somewhat of the same complexion as her brothers. So Akil Murat would have gotten his complexion from both parents, who presumably were both heavily mixed race so-called blacks. But again, this should give us an idea of how dark-skinned Charles Louis Bonaparte had to have been if he was being compared to Akil Murat with the lineage that Akil Murat had. But let's take a look at one more description of Joachim Murat to get my point across that he was indeed a mixed race so-called black man. So this is a book that was written by a woman by the name of Ida St. Elm, who writes an account of when she met Joachim Murat. And it's important to know that Ida St. Elm is known as a notoriously quote unquote unreliable author on history, but her description of Joachim Murat lines up perfectly with how he is oftentimes described by other sources. So this particular description is not inaccurate. So let's read how she described Murat. So Murat was standing in the middle of his large study, dressed as if for a state ball, in a costume of bright silk, his head surmounted by a waving plume. He had curly hair, a brown complexion, eyes that were at the same time soft and vivacious, and a proud erect head. So Ida St. Elm describes Joachim Murat as a man with a brown complexion and curly hair, physical characteristics that once again point to Joachim Murat having a strong amount of so-called black ancestry. And again, even though this woman is notoriously known to history as someone who exaggerates a lot, she did not exaggerate or concoct anything with this description of Joachim Murat. He was described having curly hair, and the last description that I read from the Duchess de Orontes, and the way she describes him wearing clothes that were or wearing clothing that was like he was ready to go out to a state ball, that was an allusion to the known flamboyant way in which Joachim Murat used to dress, which is historically accurate. So again, her description of him is accurate. And without a doubt, it signifies that he was a mixed race black man who had features that were unquestionably Negroid. And again, he was described in a similar way to Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the known black African second lieutenant in Napoleon's army, who, by the way, was also described as a man with a brown skin complexion, just like Joachim Murat. So it's safe to say that Murat was a mixed race so-called black man, but just in case, here is a portrait of him to back up the descriptions that we've seen thus far. You can see clearly the brown complexion and curly hair that he had, along with the thick lips. Definitely, he looks like a mixed race black man right here, like what one would call back in the day a quote-unquote quadroon or an octoroon, which is just another way of saying someone was a heavily mixed race black person with 1/4 black lineage in their genome or something like that. And but then here is one more image of Joachim Murat, and again you can see the descriptions of him that we just read were talking about what they were talking about when they described him as having Negroid features. This guy obviously had a black ancestry going back some ways, but this just again proves my point that the Bonaparte family had to have been of mixed race lineage as well. When you look at this and understand that Akil Murat, who had a father that looked like this, was described as having the same skin color and appearance as Charles Louis Bonaparte. These two families obviously both came from a mixed race lineage, and both of their rises to prominence came during a time when Europe was beginning to become more and more predominantly Caucasian. We can see this through the physical appearances of the nobility of the time, who became increasingly more mixed race until a lot of the quote-unquote black features that their ancestors once had were bred out. A great example of this was the Murat family themselves, who, like I stated, combined with the Bonaparte family and created a joint royal house that actually still exists to this day. The royal house lives on through one of the other sons of Joachim Murat, who was named Lucien, whose portrait can be seen right here. And Lucien, upon first glance, looks to be Caucasian, which generally tends to happen when you have generations of admixture occur that result in a lot of the original phenotypes being bred out. Joachim himself, even though he had what one would distinguish as quote-unquote black features, did not fully look like a so-called black man. Like I said, he looked like someone who was the result of generational admixture over the years, just like Napoleon and his family members, who were also, of course, of a quote-unquote mixed race lineage. So Joachim, being mixed race himself and being married to another mixed race woman, would have resulted in their offspring looking more Caucasian than anything else, while still maintaining most likely the dark skin complexion of their parents and ancestors. So this is why Joachim's son Lucien looks like this, while he himself looked like this. Once again, a clearly very mixed race so-called black man. And then when you go down the line of the Murat Bonaparte descendants, you can see that they gradually look more and more Caucasian. This is Joachim the fourth Prince of Murat. And then this is Joachim the fifth Prince of Murat. And then here is Joachim the sixth Prince of Murat. And then here is the still living descendant of the Murat family, and he looks fully Caucasian and a far cry away from what his patrilineal ancestor Joachim Murat looked like and was described looking like by people who actually saw him in person. Okay, so there are no so-called black features in this guy's appearance at all, like what was described with the original George and Murat. And this is what usually happens when there is a long history of admixture that takes place over the course of decades and even centuries. Take the Fayum mummy portraits, for example. A lot of those portraits show citizens who lived in Egypt from around the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, and you can clearly see that a lot of them were the result of admixture over the course of hundreds of years with the Macedonian Greeks, who were mostly so-called Caucasian, and they admixed with the original population of the ancient Egyptians, who were, of course, so-called black. This is what usually ends up happening to civilizations that were conquered or are in the midst of being conquered by another ethnic group and are forced or even make the decision to intermarry with other races for self-preservation. Some of the mummies from the Fayum mummy portraits look Caucasian, but the lineage goes back to the Aboriginal ancient Egyptians, who were, like I already stated, originally so-called Black Africans. But they had a lot of the original phenotypical features of theirs bred out. This is what was going on in Europe during this time period, which is why you have mixed race rulers like George and Murat and his descendants who look out and out Caucasian down to this day, like this guy right here, and even his son George, who was the 9th prince of Murat. So again, this guy has no so-called black features at all, but his lineage, as we just saw, obviously goes back to a man who himself had heavy so-called black lineage. So believe it or not, this guy has so-called black lineage, and this is the case for a lot of the nobility figures today who are actually descended from royal lines that go all the way back to the medieval time period. Most of the nobility during the medieval time period up until the Renaissance time period, which is when the Caucasians started to gain more prominence in Europe, were so-called black. But the start of the Renaissance time period is when you started to see things like the depiction of biblical figures, like, of course, Christ, and then Adam, Mary, and the disciples, etc., becoming or being portrayed as Caucasians. And I know there are manuscripts out there that are allegedly dated from the medieval time period that allegedly show Christ to have been Caucasian, but a lot of the medieval manuscripts that we see today are redone and fabricated. And I'll show this in a bit in much greater detail later on, or in the last installment of this series. But the image of Christ and the apostles and other biblical figures truly didn't start to become Caucasian until around the Renaissance time period, starting with the concoction of this fake ass letter that was allegedly written by a Roman centurion named Publius Lentulus, if I'm not mistaken, who described Christ as a man with gray, blue eyes and light-colored hair, which paved the way for a later depiction of Christ to have been painted by Leonardo da Vinci, who was Caucasian himself, and he painted this image of Christ after a man by the name of Caesar Borgia, who was also a Caucasian, which is where we get the image of Christ as a Caucasian man with long, flowing brownish or blonde hair, blue eyes, and light-colored skin. But as I showed in my previous video on the original Incan Kings list chart that showed the kings of the Incas up until the Europeans up until the Europeans took over America, starting with Charles V, who was obviously depicted as a so-called black man. The Europeans, who made the portrait of Christ that was depicted all at the very top of the chart, made Christ appear to look like a so-called black man because that is how he was originally depicted, and that is how the Europeans chose to depict him because during this time they were still so-called black, as is evidenced by the appearance of the European kings on this list. And speaking of which, this list and the way it depicts these so-called black European kings, especially the ones after Felipe IV, it shows and proves what I've been telling you guys throughout this video, that being how the European nobility became more mixed race towards the end of the 18th century, and especially into the 19th century and even further into the 20th century, when Caucasians had pretty much taken over Europe entirely. And the nobility of Europe, who actually have lineages that trace back to a lot of the original so-called black royal houses in Europe, had a lot of the phenotypes of the original black European nobility completely wiped from their physical appearances. Just looking at this chart right here, for example, the last two emperors on the chart are Charles III of Spain and his son Charles IV, who was also the king of Spain. Now, I already went over how Charles III was described in my last video and showed that contemporary sources stated that he had a quote-unquote dark brown complexion. Okay, this is obviously the skin color of someone who had black lineage, that we can easily trace back to the other predecessors on this list, going back to Charles V, who was obviously a so-called black man himself. So Charles III of Spain's lineage was so-called black. There's no denying that, which would mean that his son King Charles IV's lineage was also black as well. But then when you look down at the line after Charles IV of Spain, you can see that the admixture started to take place, because after you look at Ferdinand the seventh of Spain, who was Charles IV of Spain's son and successor to the Spanish throne, he had a daughter. Well, he had two daughters. One of them became the successor to the Spanish throne, and she was known as Isabella II. Now, when you look here at Isabella II, she looks Caucasian, even though you can kind of see that she had a prominent wide nose. That could be an indicator of her black lineage. But just like what we saw with the Joachim Murat family, or Joachim Murat's family, and how they had a lot of their so-called black features brought out of them to the point where now they look almost entirely Caucasian. So it was with the monarchs of Spain. This woman is the great times over granddaughter of Philip II of Spain, who I was already able to show was a black man, very briefly in my last video. And of course, she was the great granddaughter of Charles III of Spain, who once again was described as a man of dark brown skin complexion. And Isabella was not that far removed from Charles III of Spain, only about 2 or 3 generations after him. And it generally does not take that much time before a person who may be of a mixed race, so-called black origin, has their original phenotypes brought out from them when their parents have admixed together, and one parent is black or the other parent may be another race, particularly Caucasian. I'll use a couple of examples real quick here. So there's Meghan Markle, who is the current Duchess of Sussex and wife to quote-unquote Prince Harry of Sussex. And she is somebody who, if you look at her, she looks like a Caucasian woman, and you would never guess that she has a so-called black mother if you didn't know who she was and just looked at her upon first glance. And then when you look at their children, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's children, they look completely Caucasian with almost no hint of so-called black lineage in their appearance, but they do indeed have black lineage. Their children have black lineage coming, of course, from their maternal grandmother. And then another example is the all-time great football star and quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, who, if you know anything about him and his parentage, he is half so-called black on his father's side and half quote-unquote white on his mother's side. And when you look at his and his wife's kids, once again, they have very little to no black phenotypes at all whatsoever. But their lineage is so-called black due to their grandfather being a black man, and this was just after 2 generations of admixing with someone of another race, from his father being a quote-unquote producing a quote-unquote mulatto child and Patrick Mahomes, to Patrick Mahomes, the son who has now produced 2 quote-unquote octoroon children, who again upon first glance do not look black at all. And I'll even use one last example coming from one of the generals of Napoleon that I referenced earlier, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, who had a son that became the world-renowned creator of stories like The Three Musketeers, Monte Cristo, The Man in the Iron Mask, etc., who is known to us today as Alexandre Dumas. And by the way, Alexandre Dumas would oftentimes tell the truth of the complexion of a lot of the French royalty figures from the 16th and 17th centuries, like Louis XIII, who was the father of Louis XIV, who he described as being a man of brown complexion. But we'll get into that later in another series. But anyway, Alexandre Dumas was the son of Thomas Alexandre Dumas, and Thomas Alexandre Dumas was supposedly the son of a Caucasian French nobleman and an African slave woman. So we had so-called black lineage on his mother's side, which would of course mean that Alexandre Dumas would have had black lineage too. But when you look up portraits of Alexandre Dumas, he has the facial features of a Caucasian man, but you can still see the woolly hair of a black man that he undoubtedly inherited from his father. But his father's other negroid features are brought out due to the admixture. And then when you look down the line at Alexandre Dumas' progeny, like his son Alexandre Dumas Fils, he looks completely Caucasian. And even his other son, Alexander Dumas' other son, Henry Bauer, when you look at him, He looks pretty much completely Caucasian too. And again, this is just after two or three generations of admixture with other non so-called black races. So just imagine what a person would look like after 4, 5, 6, and so on generations of admixture, and you get what you have with a lot of these royalty figures who clearly have lineages going back to so-called blacks, such as Isabella II of Spain, who, when you look at the Incan Kings list chart again, which was made around the reign of her grandfather Charles IV of Spain's time period on the throne, so it more than accurately depicts him and how he would have looked like. But when you look at her lineage, it clearly was originally so-called black. But again, a lot of the original phenotypes that she would have had got bred out due to the admixture with other races, mainly, of course, so-called Caucasians. And this is why even her children, who were born from the union between her and her husband, who was also a direct descendant of Charles IV of Spain and had his features bred out as well. When you look at their son, Alfonso the 11th of Spain, who was the child of Isabella II of Spain, he looks completely Caucasian. But as I already stated and even showed, his lineage, whether you believe it or not, even though I think I've shown enough evidence from Philip II of Spain on down to Charles III of Spain and the rest of the rulers of Spain on the Incan Kings list chart, that these people were originally so-called black. But whether you believe it or not, it is up to you. But this man did indeed have black lineage. And once again, whether you believe me or not is up to you. But even the current so-called king of Spain, King Felipe VI of Spain, who was a lineal descendant of the kings of Spain's royal lineage, even he has black lineage going all the way back to his patrilineal ancestors like Philip II of Spain, Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles III of Spain, who, don't forget, was a man that was described as having a dark brown complexion, all right? So yes, this man has black lineage, but just like the other examples that I showed with Alexandre Dumas and his parentage, and even with the Murats, those were two families that obviously at some point in time had black ancestors, but their features had been bred out due to the admixture with a lot of the incumbent Caucasians that were starting to take over the landscape of Europe. I explained how a lot of the black population died off in my first video in this series on the Black Plague. About 50% of the entire European population died of the Black Plague, which equated to about 50 million people who died in total. And even before the Black Plague, there was another plague that spread during the time period of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's reign that killed off like 30 to 50 million people as well. And the vast majority of those people who died during those plagues were the so-called black Europeans. And so that is how their numbers started to decrease so much. This coupled with the conquering of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks, who once again were Caucasians, who descended from the same ilk as the Khazarian Turks that I referenced once again in my last series, and the Khazars. And the Khazars, if you guys who watched that first video remember, were the wild men, the quote unquote wild men, or at least a segment of the wild men who brought the Black Death into Europe in the first place. So that is how you know that this was the first major introduction of the Caucasian into Europe. But after all of these events occurred, is when you started to see the ushering in of the era known as the Renaissance, which as I stated earlier, was the time period where the Caucasian started to permeate all throughout Europe and change things like the images of the biblical figures and other pieces of ancient artwork to make them look more Caucasian. Those pieces of art to look more Caucasian. This is what was happening in Europe, and this is why Europe looks the way it does today. This is why the royalty figures of Europe look the way they do today as well. And it is important to understand this. And this is why I had to create this series before I really started to dive into the medieval time period and the black rulership that existed during that time, because it was indeed it was very much a real thing that actually occurred. But just to prove even further that this was indeed the case, I'm just going to show a few more royal dynasties from other countries in Europe that clearly also went through this racial admixture that caused their descendants to look the way they do today. This monarchy we're going to look at are the Russian czars and emperors, and we're going to take a look at the first emperor of Russia, Peter the Great, and see how he was described. So this description is going to come from one of Peter the Great's generals, who of course saw him and knew him personally. So this was of course an eyewitness account of what Peter the Great looked like. So let's read what he has to say. So the Tsarewitz, or Peter the Great, arrived in Moscow this winter, where I saw him for the first time. He kept a mean Finlandish woman, or a mean Finlandish girl, for his mistress. I went often with the general to wait on him, and he came frequently to the general's house, commonly attended by a very mean and low persons. He was very slovenly in his dress. His person was tall, well made, of a brown complexion, black hair and eyes, of a stern countenance and strong voice. So this was how Peter the Great was described by his close confidant, Jacob Bruce, and he was described as a man with brown complexion, right? i.e. a man of color, or a so-called black man. But let's look at a couple of portraits depicting Peter the Great to visualize what he would have looked like. So this is a portrait of Tsar Peter the Great with that same brown skin complexion that he was described having. Now, Peter the Great in this image looks to be one of the quote-unquote mulatto or mixed race monarchs that I've been talking about, and he surely would have fell right in line with when the mulatto royal class of Europe was starting to arise, because he reigned during the late 1600s into the 1700s. So that was right in line with when a lot of the monarchs started to admix with so-called Caucasians. But this this portrait right here could very well be just another altered version of a portrait that is supposed to depict Peter the Great. But either way, he is accurately portrayed with brown skin, just like he was described having from the eyewitness account quote I just cited from. But either way, Peter the Great was a so-called black man and was described as such. And he was described as having, of course, a brown complexion, not a pale complexion or a pale face complexion, like how this portrait right here shows him to be. This portrait right here is a far cry from how Peter the Great was described by someone who actually knew him. This is an obvious fake painting, and you know the complexion that Peter the Great was described having is very close to how a certain alleged black African that was given to Peter the Great as a gift, allegedly, has been given, and he's this person has been given the moniker, the quote-unquote Moor of Peter the Great. Here is a portrait of this man right here, and this man was known as Abram Petrovich Ganibal, who he became a nobleman of Russia, and I believe he was one of Peter the Great's generals. But yeah, this guy has a brown complexion. He obviously in this portrait has a brown complexion, just like how Peter the Great was described having, right? And you know, Peter the Great's skin color from this portrait right here that accurately depicts him is very similar to the portrait that was made of one of Abraham Petrovich Ganibal's sons, who was named Ivan Ganibal, and I believe he himself was a mulatto, but still obviously a man of color with a black African man as his dad. But look at his complexion in comparison to Peter's right here in his portrait, and it's pretty identical, which is one of the things that lead me to believe that Peter the Great was a mulatto, since he had the same mulatto skin color and some of the same mulatto features that this person Ivan Ganibal had. But one thing is for certain, this portrait of Ivan Ganibal looks far more close in relation to Peter the Great than the fake ass portrait that we saw of Peter the Great, which shows him as a Caucasian. But let me show just one more portrait of Peter the Great that clearly depicts him as a so-called black man. So this is yet another portrait of Peter the Great that was painted circa 1715. And just by looking at this portrait, we can see that Peter the Great is portrayed looking like a so-called black man, but possibly a mixed race or mulatto type of black man. But he was still a black man nevertheless. But one thing I will say is that it looks like they may have painted over a little bit and took away some of the brown skin color that Peter the Great was described as having. But just imagine this portrait with a deeper skin of brown complexion, or a deeper tone of brown, kind of like the last portrait that I showed, which displayed him with a clear brown complexion, and that is most likely what Peter the Great looked like. So please tell me that this wasn't a so-called black man, that Peter the Great was not indeed a so-called black man. I mean, honestly, it should be no question at all whatsoever. And Peter the Great's so-called black appearance and brown skin color trickled down to his sons, one of them being named Alexei Petrovich, who was also described like his father as having a brown complexion. But it didn't stop with just his son, because his niece, who also became a monarch of Russia herself, who was known to history as Anne of Russia, was also described by eyewitness accounts as being a woman with a brown complexion as well. But let's see the exact quote that confirms that this is indeed true. So let's read this description of Anne, who was the Empress of Russia, real quick. who once again was the niece of Peter the Great. Okay, so, but let's read this real quick right here. So the Tsarina Anne is a large made woman, but well shaped for her size and easy and graceful in her person. She has a brown complexion, black hair, and dark blue eyes. Okay, so yet again, another one of Peter the Great's relatives being documented as having a brown complexion. So it's safe to say that Peter the Great, as well as his entire family, had to be people of color or so-called black people. And Peter the Great's reign as Emperor of Russia marked the latter stages of the rulership for the original stock of Russians that had reigned over Russia since the time of the Kievan Rus, who I already briefly showed in my first video in this series, were so-called black. And so a lot of the latter portion of the Russian czars who were black and had the appearance of black people started to die out towards the latter half of the 1700s, going into the 1800s. And this is evidenced by a description that was given by one of the last melanated or so-called black-looking Russian emperors, Paul I of Russia. So let's just see how Paul I of Russia was described real quick here. So let's read this description of Paul I of Russia when he was a child and see how he was described. So according to a story repeated by foreign envoys in Russia in 1755, when a lady at court remarked on the contrast in complexion between Peter, his father, and Paul, the baby being very brown. Okay, so according to these Russian envoys, Paul I of Russia, who at the time when these Russian envoys saw him and relayed this story, was about 1 year old, since he was born in 1754, and this story was given in 1755. So, but anyway, so they saw him as a baby and they described him as being a very brown complexioned child, or a very brown complexioned baby. And then it goes on to say that Catherine II of Russia, his mother, insinuated that Paul I might have been a bastard child because his skin color didn't match up with the skin color of his father, Peter III, who was described as being very pale. He was traditionally described as being very pale. And please keep in mind that Catherine II was descended from Peter the Great and his wife Catherine I, and we should already know what Peter the Great was described as. What Peter the Great was described as being. He was described as being a man of brown complexion, which is probably where he inherited it from, where Paul I inherited his brown complexion from. And that's assuming that he was not a bastard child. Okay, but also keep in mind that Peter III of Russia, even though he was not descended from the same lineage as Peter the Great, Peter III of Russia was descended from Danish and Swedish royalty, from guys like Christian IV of Denmark, who I already showed was a black man himself, and various other members of the Danish royal house of Oldenburg. So Peter III could have also been a black man as well, with a very light colored complexion that could have come from admixture, his complexion coming from admixture. But Paul was also alleged to have been a bastard child due to him having such a dark complexion and Peter III having such a light complexion. And one of the main candidates for Paul I's actual father that allegedly had an affair with Catherine II was a man by the name of Count Soltykov, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But I just want to go over real quick here how he was described looking like in relation to Paul I. So let's read this excerpt real quick right here, starting from where it says Count. So Count Soltykov, who is the only personage likely to have been Paul's father, supposing that Paul was Catherine's illegitimate son, had black hair and eyes and a very dark complexion, none of which was found in any of Paul's descendants. Okay, so this excerpt reveals a couple of things. First, it just confirms that Paul had to have had very dark skin complexion or brown skin color, like we saw him being described having from the last description that I just read from. But it also suggests that in the very last part of this sentence right here, that Paul and his supposed father had very dark skin complexion that was not seen in any of Paul I's descendants. Okay, so this right here gives us an insight into the difference that existed between the appearance of Paul I, or if he was indeed the son of Peter III and not a bastard, then that would mean that he was still the result of admixture as well, mainly from his father's side, but also from his mother's side as well. Since, like I stated, she was the daughter of Peter the Great. Paul I's mother was the daughter of Peter the Great, and although Peter the Great was still a so-called black man, a lot of the real portions of him show him to have been a mulatto or a mixed race person. So this admixture would have trickled down to Paul I, which resulted in his descendants looking like this. This is Alexander II of Russia, Paul's great-great-great-grandson, and of course, he has nowhere near the same complexion as Paul was described having, and even as his ancestors were described having. Even though it's hard to visualize, again, this man did indeed have black, so-called black lineage. Just take a look at one of his maternal grandfathers in Peter the Great, and it's obvious that he did indeed have black lineage. So this guy, all the way down to the very last Russian Tsar before the original line of the Tsars was abolished and taken down by Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was one of the major turning points for the black nobility in Europe. A lot of the Marxist revolution started around the late 1700s into 1848, where there were a lot of revolutions that were taking place at once, all in Europe, in areas like France, Germany, Austria, Italy, etc. And even though a lot of these revolutions failed in 1848, these revolutions in 1848, they failed, but they still set the stage for the later abolishment of monarchical rule in Europe, which occurred in and around after World War I. So that is, in a short summary, how monarchy ended in Europe, and the vast majority of the monarchs in Europe during this time period were in fact descended from the so-called black nobility of centuries past. Whether people understand that or not, even though I think I've presented some pretty good examples of that so far. But let's just take a look at a few more examples before I close out this video. So this right here is a man by the name of Johann George, who descended from a very prominent royal house in Germany known as the Hohenzollerns. And this royal house is still active today, and the descendants of which we'll see in a minute. But anyway, this guy right here is standing next to his wife, Elizabeth of Anhalt. And just by looking at this photo, we can see that Johann George is a black man, and his wife, Elizabeth of Anhalt, is represented as a Caucasian lady. Okay, so this is a prime example of a lot of the racial admixture that was going on in Europe during this time period. And these two, I believe, lived during the late 1500s into the 1600s, which was right around the time where Caucasians started to make their way more and more into Europe. And they started to gain more prestige, or more of a certain level of prestige, by creating their own royal houses after one of the members of their family had gained titles of nobility by either performing well in battle or through performing certain exploits through the church and rising up in the ranks of the church. Like the Borgias, for example, they did this during the Renaissance time period. And so, but more and more families of nobility started to look more like this woman right here in this medallion, who is standing right next to Johann George, who again is obviously a so-called black man. So this admixture that was occurring in Europe over the course of centuries is one of the reasons why a lot of the black phenotypes of a lot of regular citizens in Europe have gone away, and why they ultimately look very Caucasian with almost no trace of so-called black lineage through their physical appearance at all. But just getting back to this medallion right here. Again, Johann George of the House of Hohenzollern is a black man, and so was his father as well. If you can see this coin of him right here that I have on the screen. Johann George's father was named Joachim II of Hohenzollern. He clearly right here is depicted as a so-called black man in this coin. There's no doubt about that. So we can see where Johann George got his black ancestry from. And so when we look at one more member of the House of Hohenzollern, who was a man by the name of Prince Albert, Duke of Prussia, and from this portrait of Albert, Duke of Prussia, he obviously looks like a man with so-called black lineage, or a so-called black man. But again, he looks like he's very mixed race. To me, at least, he favors the Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott a lot in the face, and even with the hair or the hairline right there. And of course, Dak Prescott himself is of mixed race origins. Right, he's a man who is a quote unquote half black and half white person, or he has half black and half white lineage. Okay, so that sounds about right for what Prince Albert most likely was as well. And then here goes just one last depiction of Prince Albert, Duke of Prussia, and once again he is presented as a man of color. They gave him a little bit more of a brown complexion here, which is most likely what his true complexion was. Okay, so we get the point here from the few images that I've shown of the House of Hohenzollern. These people were originally so-called black, but they were yet another noble house that had their phenotypes spread out due to a lot of the incumbent Caucasian population at the time that was becoming more and more common in Europe. And we can see the results of the admixture down to today, with the current members of the House of Hohenzollern looking like this. The same result as the multitude of mixed race families that I've shown all throughout this video can be seen here with this person who's a member of the House of Hohenzollern. Okay, but another royal house that was the result of this admixture, and this royal house that was the result of this admixture was the royal house that came from the long line of the Holy Roman emperors that had dominated Europe since the 7th century AD all the way into the latter portion of the 1700s going into the 1800s. And this house was known as the House of Habsburg. And we've already seen a few members of the House of Habsburg in Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and even Philip II of Spain, and their descendants on the Incan Kings list chart, and they were unquestionably so-called black. But we're just going to take a look at a few of the latter members of the House of Habsburg, and with these string of emperors, we're going to start first by looking at Emperor Leopold I and see how he was described. So let's read this description of Emperor Leopold I, which was written during his lifetime and during his reign on the throne. So let's just see what this has to say right here. So this prince of low stature and of a brownish complexion. Okay, so just stopping right there, we can see that this contemporary source during King Leopold's life states that he was of a brownish complexion, i.e., he was a man of color. And of course, when you look up supposed portraits of him, he looks nothing of the sort. And I believe there was even an excerpt on the Britannica History website that states Leopold had a pale complexion. So just that's just more of an example of the defamation to the real appearance of these historical figures and of these rulers and emperors and kings and stuff like that, who were described differently by people who actually saw them and who actually lived during their lifetimes, such as this book right here. Is looking completely different from how the mainstream portrays them or depicts them. Okay, but yes, Leopold I was a man of color, and so were his successors, who were also his sons. The first of his sons to rule after him was Emperor Joseph I of the Holy Roman Empire. So let's just see how he was described. So let's read this description of Emperor Joseph I. So the emperor is a little man of that says swarthy complexion, and has thick hanging lips, which last, as some will have it, is the distinguishing mark of the Austrian family. So this is yet another Holy Roman emperor that is described as a man of color, and he's described as having a so-called swarthy complexion, but he's also described as having thick lips, which according to this book, that was once again written around the time period of this emperor's reign in Europe. This was a common trait of this royal house, or of this royal family. Okay, the modern day alleged descendants of the House of Habsburg have none of the physical characteristics of any of these people. None of them even have the Habsburg jaw that was very pervasive within their family due to generations of intermixture with their own family members, and is a trait that you would think would pass down to the generation of so-called Habsburgs today. So who knows? These people could be just pretending to the Habsburg name and throne, like I already showed in my last video of how a Caucasian quite literally tried to pretend to be Charles II of England so that he could not only gain his identity but his titles as Prince of Wales, and even eventually the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But whether these people are the actual descendants of the Habsburgs or not, their ancestors, if they were in fact the descendants of the Habsburgs, their ancestors such as Leopold I and Joseph I obviously were described as men of color. But let's just stop there. Let's not stop there. Let's take a look at a couple more of these latter emperors. The next one we'll take a look at was the brother of Joseph I, and of course also the son of Leopold I, Charles VI. So let's read and see how Charles VI was described. So now let's get this description of the other son of Leopold I, Charles VI of the House of Habsburg. So let's read. So the Emperor Charles VI is of a middling stature and in good plight of body. He is of a swarthy hale complexion, has a brisk eye and thick lips. So once again, this is yet another House of Habsburg family member who was described as being a man of color with a swarthy complexion and those thick lips that the previous description that I read from stated was very common amongst this family. So there should be no doubt that these Holy Roman Emperors, these latter Holy Roman Emperors I just read descriptions of, were so-called black men. And all you have to do is just look at their Habsburg counterparts in Spain with guys like Charles V all the way on down to Charles III of Spain, who was described as a man of dark brown complexion, to see that the Habsburg family was comprised of people of color. But as the years went on, particularly after Charles VI's reign had ended in 1740, is when the Habsburg family started to change, especially with their house's affiliations with another royal house known as the House of Lorraine, which was integrated into the House of Habsburg by way of the marriage between Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, and her husband, Francis I of Lorraine. From here is where the admixture started to become more prevalent within the Habsburg family, with more quote-unquote mulatto emperors ruling over the realms that the Habsburgs had. Emperors like Leopold II, who through engravings like this, you can still see that he maintained his swarthy complexion, but his facial features are more leaning towards the appearance of a mulatto. And then even this engraving right here, once again, shows him with a brown complexion, but also with mulatto features as well. So there was clearly some admixture that took place with the House of Habsburg. And as I stated earlier, the current alleged descendants of the House of Habsburg do not fit the descriptions of their supposed ancestors, who were clearly people of color with so-called black facial features like their thick lips to go along with their brown or swarthy complexions. None of the modern day Habsburgs have those physical characteristics, or these physical characteristics, including the Habsburg jaw. But that could just be due to a lot of the admixture over the course of time that made these distinctive features fade. But the modern day claimants are indeed if the modern day claimants are indeed the descendants of the Habsburgs from the medieval time period all the way on down to the mid to late 1700s, then they would just be more victims to the very pervasive admixture that was taking place in Europe over these centuries. Just like with the Murat family, or with the Hohenzollerns, or the family of the Russian Tsars, and even the Bonapartes, the House of Habsburg was most likely the result of this heavy admixture that the black nobility and royalty were forced to have to be subject to during their latter stages of their rule over Europe during the mid to late 1700s into the 1800s. And there is one more example that I'll show in my next video in this series that found its way into a country that was responsible for one of the most well-known occurrences of slave trading in history, which was known as the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the country of Portugal, led by a man who was the son of King John I of Portugal, named Prince Henry the Navigator. And then fast forward some centuries afterwards, and you'll see another King John of Portugal, this time King John VI of Portugal, who became the ruler of Portugal, but would later venture out to South America and become the first ever king of Brazil. And his establishment of a Brazilian monarchy was stretched all the way down to his grandson, who was Pedro II of Brazil, who we can clearly see here is a man who looks to be Caucasian. But when you take a look at a picture that was drawn of his grandfather, John VI of Portugal, during his lifetime, you can clearly see that John VI not only looks like a so-called mixed-race black man, but he is literally described as such on this newspaper article that was branded with the same word that I've been using to describe a lot of these admixed so-called black nobility figures during the latter years of their rulership in Europe, which is mulatto. Okay, so we're going to take a look at and see how this came to be, while also gaining a better understanding of what went on during this time period that we know of today as the antebellum or slave time period in our people's history. Because a lot of it does not get explained to our people of what really happened during this era in history, and how our people really came here into the Americas. Okay, particularly in North America, but even into the southern regions of America as well, where slavery was far more prevalent out there than it is in Northern America, which, is portrayed oftentimes as the face of the slave trade. That's how it's portrayed to us, so-called blacks, as being the face of slave trade North America is. But anyway, so we'll take a look at all that stuff in the next video.